Ruby Prescott slapped her winning hand down on the table for the fourth Friday night in a row, and still had no idea that every single card had been arranged precisely, so she could do exactly that. The saloon in Dusty Creek, Nevada, in the autumn of 1882, was the kind of place that smelled like sawdust, whiskey, and the particular brand of desperation that follows a man from one failed mining claim to the next. The piano player in the corner worked through the same 4 songs in a rotating loop, and the oil lamps along the walls threw amber light across faces that had seen too much sun and not enough kindness. It was not the sort of place a woman like Ruby Prescott was supposed to be, and yet there she sat every Friday evening, spine straight as a fence post, green eyes sharp enough to cut glass, her dark hair pinned up under a modest hat that she'd bought in Sacramento 3 years ago and still wore as if it were brand new. She had come to Dusty Creek because her father had left her a deed to a small parcel of land just east of town after dying of a fever in the spring, and she had come to the saloon because the land agent who handled the deed transfer, a round-faced man named Clarence Hobbs, had explained to her with theatrical patience that the deed's legitimacy was being contested by a neighboring rancher named Denton Graves, and that the legal fees to defend her claim would cost more than she currently had to her name. Someone had told her, in the vague way that people offer useless information when they want to seem helpful, that the Friday night poker game at the Silver Lantern Saloon sometimes paid out enough to make a real difference to a person's financial situation. Ruby had never played poker in her life before that first Friday. She had barely played cards at all, unless you counted the children's games she'd played with her younger sisters back in Missouri, which she did not, because she was a practical woman and knew that matching pictures of roosters had nothing in common with bluffing grown men out of their money. And yet she had walked in through those swinging doors on the first Friday in September, settled herself at the poker table with $40 she could not afford to lose, and proceeded to win 80. The man across the table from her, the tall one with the dark hat and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something that wasn't quite wood but wasn't quite stone either, had folded at a moment that even she had recognized as strange. He'd had good cards. She'd caught a glimpse when he laid them down, not enough to read them clearly, but enough to see that he had not been beat, not truly. His name was Abel Walden, and half the men in the saloon had nodded at him when he walked in, which told her he was known in town, and the other half had stepped slightly out of his way, which told her he was respected, or at least that he was the kind of man people didn't want to accidentally crowd. He was 28 years old, though Ruby didn't know that yet. He had the look of someone who had spent the majority of those years outdoors, weathered in the way that spoke of honest work rather than hard living, and his eyes were a deep, quiet brown that she noticed only because they kept finding her from across the table in a way that was not rude but was very deliberate. He had smiled when she raked in her winnings, a slow, genuine kind of smile, and said, "Good game, miss." She had told him her name was Ruby Prescott, because she saw no reason to be coy about it, and he had touched the brim of his hat and said his name was Abel Walden, and that was the end of their conversation for that evening. She had gone home to the small rented room above the feed store that she was paying for by the week, and counted her money twice and thought about the lawyer's fees, and thought about her father's land and thought, briefly, about the way Abel Walden had smiled. She came back the next Friday. The October air had a bite to it by the second week, the kind of cold that the Nevada high desert threw down from the mountains without much warning, and Ruby had put on her better coat, the charcoal gray wool one that had a small ink stain on the left cuff that she'd tried for 2 years to remove and had finally accepted as permanent. She had spent the intervening week reading about poker. The general store had a water-damaged copy of a book about card games that the owner, Mr. Tillman, had let her borrow for the price of a polite conversation about his rheumatism, and she had studied the pages with the same diligence she'd once brought to learning her father's bookkeeping. So she came to the table that second Friday feeling more prepared, more certain, and she played what she believed was a smarter game. She watched the other players. She counted cards with the rough approximation of someone who'd only just learned the system. She folded when she thought she should fold and raised when she thought the hand warranted it. And she won again. $60 this time, pulled from the pot in 4 separate hands over the course of the evening, and she could feel the other players' irritation like a warmth coming off a stove. A man named Foster, who wore a red handkerchief knotted around his throat and had the thick fingers of someone who'd done a lot of heavy lifting before he decided card games were easier, had pushed back from the table at one point and said something under his breath that she'd chosen to ignore. Abel Walden had said, quietly but clearly enough for the table to hear, "Game's the game, Foster. Leave it." Foster had left it. Ruby had looked at Abel across the table, and he had looked back at her with that same steady, unhurried gaze, and she had thought again that there was something odd about how he played against her. Not that she had the experience to pinpoint exactly what it was. Just a feeling, faint and easily dismissed, like hearing a wrong note in a familiar song and then convincing yourself the song had always sounded that way. They talked a little more that second Friday, while the other players drifted away and the piano player switched to something slower. Abel had asked her what brought her to Dusty Creek, and she had told him about her father's land and the legal dispute with Denton Graves, because she was not the kind of woman who danced around things, and because she was starting to suspect that in a town this size, most people already knew most things anyway. Abel's expression had shifted when she mentioned Graves. Something tightened at the corners of his eyes just briefly before he smoothed it away. He said that Graves was a man who had a habit of finding ways to acquire things that didn't belong to him, and that she would be wise to get a good lawyer before Graves got a better one. She told him that was precisely what the poker winnings were for. He had looked at her for a long moment, as if recalibrating something internal, and then nodded. "You're doing all right then," he said, and it came out sounding like more than a casual observation, like he meant something that the words themselves didn't quite carry. She went home and counted her money again and thought about Denton Graves, and about the ink stain on her cuff, and about Abel Walden's eyes in the lamplight. The third Friday, she arrived at the Silver Lantern to find the regular game already starting, and Abel Walden was sitting in his usual chair with a cup of coffee in front of him instead of a drink, which struck her as interesting. He was talking to the saloon's owner, a heavy-set woman named Vera Calloway, who ran the place with the efficiency of a military commander and the warmth of a favorite aunt, and whatever they were discussing stopped when Ruby walked in. Vera Calloway looked at Ruby with a frankly appraising eye and said, "You're the girl who's been winning at my tables. I want you to know that's either very lucky or very good, and I haven't decided which yet." Ruby said, "It might be both." Vera had laughed, a big genuine laugh that earned her immediate and permanent respect in Ruby's estimation, and Abel had smiled into his coffee cup in a way that he clearly thought no one noticed. Ruby sat down and played, and she won again. This time the pot was smaller, $70 spread across a longer evening, and she had to work harder for it, or so she believed. She made what she thought were clever plays. She bluffed successfully on a hand she was nearly certain she would lose, and the thrill of it, the clean electric jolt of watching 3 men fold when they should have stayed, was something she hadn't expected to enjoy as much as she did. She was thinking about the bluff, about the precise moment she'd pushed her chips forward with a steadiness she'd had to manufacture from somewhere in the vicinity of her stomach, when she glanced across the table and caught Abel Walden watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't admiration exactly, though there was something of that in it. It was more like the look a person gets when they see something they've been hoping for come to pass. Quiet satisfaction, and something warmer underneath it. He glanced away before she could examine it properly, and she told herself she was reading too much into a tired man's expression at the end of a long Friday night. They walked out of the Silver Lantern at the same time, which happened by coincidence or something that resembled it, and the October night was sharp and clear, the kind of sky that the desert throws up when it's decided to be beautiful on purpose. Ruby pulled her coat tighter, and they stood for a moment on the boardwalk in the natural pause that falls between two people who have been in each other's company all evening and are not quite ready to stop. Abel asked if she was walking home, and she said she was, and he said the east side of town was on his way, and she said she lived above the feed store, which was exactly on the east side, and they walked together through the quiet dark street without either of them acknowledging that they were choosing to do so. He told her about himself in the spare, careful way of a man who was not used to talking about himself, but was making an effort. He ran a cattle operation about 4 miles out of town, a medium-sized ranch that he'd built up over 6 years from a plot of land he'd bought with everything he had at 22. He had 2 hired hands, a Mexican vaquero named Emilio who had been with him since the beginning and a younger man named Pete who had arrived the previous spring with calloused hands and good instincts and not much else. He had grown up in Texas, come to Nevada following a brother who had since moved on to Oregon, and had decided he liked the land here better than any place he'd tried before. Ruby told him about Missouri, about her father's bookkeeping business and her mother who had died when Ruby was 16, about the 2 younger sisters she still wrote letters to, about the decision to come to Nevada alone at 26 to claim a piece of land she'd never seen on behalf of a father she missed with a fierceness that surprised her sometimes. Abel listened the way very few people listened, with his whole attention, not planning what to say next or waiting for a gap, but actually taking in what she was telling him. It made her talk more than she intended to. When they reached the feed store and she turned to say goodnight, she realized she'd told him things she hadn't told anyone else in Dusty Creek, and she wasn't sure when that had happened. He touched his hat and said goodnight in a voice that was low and careful, and she climbed the stairs to her room and stood at the window for a while watching the street below go dark. The 4th Friday arrived, and with it came the moment that changed everything. Ruby had spent the week doing 2 things simultaneously: meeting with a lawyer named Hadfield who had an office above the telegraph station, and thinking about Abel Walden with a frequency that she kept trying to reduce and kept failing to. Hadfield was a careful, methodical man who wore spectacles and spoke about her legal case with the kind of measured optimism that told her he thought she had a reasonable chance if she could raise the remaining fees, and if Graves's lawyer, a man Hadfield described as sharp and unscrupulous, didn't find a way to delay the proceedings until she ran out of money entirely. She needed to win again. She came to the Silver Lantern that 4th Friday with her $40 starting stake and her studied poker face and her wool coat with the ink stain, and she sat down at the table and played. The evening went well. She won early hands easily and built her stack and felt the growing confidence of someone who has started to believe they are genuinely good at something. The other players shifted and grumbled, and she paid careful attention to their tells and their habits. She was, she believed, playing the best poker of her brief career. And then, about halfway through the evening, she noticed something. It happened on a hand where she held a pair of 10s and had been debating whether to fold, because the pot was sizable and the risk felt genuine. She pushed a modest raise forward and watched the other men at the table respond. 3 folded quickly. Abel Walden studied his cards, then studied the pot, then met her eyes across the table for a fraction of a second before he, too, folded. And when he laid his cards down, face down as was his right, one of them turned over at the corner just enough that Ruby, who was sitting at an angle that made it possible, saw the face. He had been holding a full house. She had beaten him with a pair of 10s, a pair of 10s against a full house. She said nothing. She raked in the chips with steady hands and kept her expression exactly where it was, neutral and focused, while somewhere behind her ribs something clicked into place like the tumbler of a very old lock, finally finding the right combination. A pair of tens. She played out the rest of the evening on autopilot, her mind working backward at tremendous speed. The first week, when he'd folded on a hand she was almost certain he'd had. The second week, when Foster had been about to cause trouble and Abel had intervened. The third week, that expression she hadn't been able to name, that quiet satisfaction. She had been winning every week. He had been letting her win every week. For an entire month, Abel Walden had been sitting across from her at that poker table, and deliberately, carefully, consistently folding hands he could have won, staying in on hands he should have folded to push other players out so she could take their money instead, engineering every single one of her victories with the patient precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had decided to do it without telling her. She finished the game and walked out of the Silver Lantern into the November night, which was considerably colder than October had been, and stood on the boardwalk breathing the cold air and feeling the complicated storm of emotions that was building somewhere in her chest. She was furious. She was, beneath the fury, something else entirely, something she needed to think about before she could name it properly. Abel came out of the saloon about 10 minutes later, which he'd been doing every Friday, and found her still standing on the boardwalk. He paused when he saw her. The look on his face told her immediately that he understood something was different tonight. He had good instincts, she thought, just not quite good enough. Ruby, he said, and the use of her first name, which they'd slipped into sometime in the past few weeks without formal discussion, landed differently than it usually did. She turned to look at him fully. "You've been letting me win," she said. She said it simply, without heat, because she'd used the 10 minutes outside to get the heat under control. The simplest sentences were often the most effective. She'd learned that from watching her father. Abel Walden was quiet for a moment. In the lamplight from the saloon's front window she could see him working through options, not calculating how to deceive her but deciding how much truth to offer. She could tell the difference. "Yes," he said finally, "every week. Yes, for the entire month. Yes." She looked at him and he looked at her, and the night was very still around them, the kind of stillness the desert produces when it's paying attention. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. Not calculating, something more careful and more honest. "Because," he said, "when you walked in that first Friday, Graves's man was at the table. Harmon, the one with the gray vest. He was planning to take every dollar you put down, and I knew that because he'd done it to 3 other people who'd come in with small stakes and big problems, and Graves paid him a portion of what he won." He paused. "And because you told me about your father's land and what it meant to you, and I thought you deserved to win." Ruby absorbed this. "Harmon hasn't been at the table for the last 2 weeks. No, he left when the pickings got less predictable. But you kept doing it." "Yes," Abel said, and his voice was quieter now. "Because," she pressed. He looked at her for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was the look of a man standing at the edge of something, weighing the risk of what comes next. "Because by the second week," he said slowly, "I wanted you to keep coming back." The words settled between them in the cold November air, and neither of them moved. Ruby's heart was doing something she didn't entirely have authority over. She was still angry, or she had been, but the anger was changing shape into something she recognized as the feeling of realizing that someone has been paying close, careful, costly attention to you without asking for anything in return. "You lost money," she said. 4 weeks of losing money on purpose. It wasn't much taken in proportion. "Abel, you ran hands backward for a month. I know what I did. You should have told me. I know that too." She turned away from him and looked at the dark street, at the horses tied at the rail, at the lamplight spilling amber across the dust. She thought about her father's land and the lawyer Hadfield and the deed that her father had wanted her to have. She thought about sitting across the table from this man every Friday for 4 weeks and feeling, each time, the growing warmth of someone's specific interest in her well-being. She thought about a full house laid face down in a pile of folded cards. "You're going to tell me everything," she said at last, turning back to him. "About how you did it and when you started planning it and how you kept the other players from noticing, because I want to understand exactly what you did." Something in Abel's expression shifted, relaxed, opened. "All right," he said. "And then," she added, "you're going to buy me a cup of coffee at Vera Calloway's bar and tell me the rest of it, the part you haven't said yet." He was quiet, but his eyes were very warm. "I can do that," he said. They went back inside. Vera Calloway, who had a talent for reading a room that would have made her an extraordinary poker player if she'd ever bothered to sit down at the table, produced 2 cups of coffee, and then found something urgent to attend to at the other end of the bar, leaving them alone at a small corner table. Abel explained it with the honest directness of a man who decided halfway through the conversation to be entirely truthful, and Ruby listened. The first week, he said, he'd recognized what Harmon was doing and had decided on the fly to interfere. He'd had a strong hand in the second-to-last round and had folded it not because he was planning anything particular but because he'd wanted to give Ruby the round and see what she did with it. What she'd done with it was play with a steady nerve that had surprised him. "I thought it would be the one time," he said. "That first week. I thought you'd take your winnings and that would be that. But I came back. You came back, and then I started thinking about it differently. Harmon was still there the second week. And I'd heard more about your situation from Vera, who hears everything in this town, and I decided that if you were going to play, you were going to win because you were playing for something real and most of the men at that table weren't. You could have simply told me Harmon was there. I could have. But you didn't know me yet, and I didn't know whether you'd believe me, or whether Harmon might make trouble if he thought you'd been warned off." He paused. "And I liked the idea of being useful to you." "I know that sounds presumptuous." "It sounds like something else entirely," Ruby said and looked at her coffee cup. Abel said, "What I didn't plan on was the rest of it." "What rest of it?" He looked at her steadily. "Wanting to keep doing it not because of Harmon or Graves or the land dispute, but because I wanted to see you win. Because I started looking forward to Friday in a way I hadn't looked forward to something in a long time. Because talking to you on the walk home was the best part of my week." He stopped, as if he'd used up a reservoir of words that wasn't typically available to him. "That part I hadn't planned on." Ruby's hands were wrapped around her coffee cup and the coffee was warm against her palms and the saloon was quieter now, most of the other patrons gone, and she felt something she'd been holding carefully for 4 weeks finally release its tension. "You could have simply asked to walk me home," she said, "without the elaborate card strategy. I know that now, or talk to me on any of those Fridays. I talk to you every Friday. You know what I mean." "Yes," he said and almost smiled. "I do." They were quiet together, the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't demand filling. "The land," she said at last, coming back to practical ground because she was a practical woman and needed it under her feet. "Hadfield thinks I have a real case if I have enough to pay his fees and retain him through the proceedings. What I've won over the past 4 weeks puts me close, but not quite there." Abel was watching her. "How much short?" $30 perhaps, maybe a little more." "I'll stake it," he said. Ruby's head came up. "No, Ruby. You've already been throwing poker games for a month on my behalf. I will not take your money on top of it. Then think of it as a loan. I will find another way to raise it." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and she noticed again the quality of his attention, the way it made you feel that whatever you said next was going to be received with full seriousness. "You've spent a month playing a card game to pay legal fees for land that should be yours by right. You've done it alone in a town you didn't know. With $40 you couldn't afford to lose, twice a week's wages on a single evening's gamble. That's not the act of someone who needs anyone to take over. It's the act of someone who deserves not to have to fight every single inch of this alone." He paused. "Let me help. Not because I think you can't manage, because I'd like to." Ruby looked at him for a long time. "25, she said finally. "That's what I need, and I'll pay it back out of the land's first income." 25, he agreed, and the small negotiation felt like its own kind of contract, the terms of which were about considerably more than money. "And you have to stop letting me win at cards," she said. If I ever play poker again, I want to earn it properly. I'll teach you, he said, properly, how to read a hand, how to read a player. You've got the nerve for it. What you need is the knowledge. The idea of sitting across from Abel Walden and learning poker without the elaborate shadow game between them felt, she thought, like something she was very much looking forward to. She finished her coffee and stood up, and he stood up with her, and Vera Calloway appeared from the far end of the bar with a knowing expression that Ruby chose to ignore. Same time next week, Abel asked, and the question was doing more work than it appeared to. I'll be here, Ruby said. She walked home through the cold night alone, and this time the thought she kept returning to was not about her father's land or lawyer Hadfield or the remaining legal fees. It was about a man who had folded a full house on purpose and then done it again the next week and the week after that and never said a word about it, and about the expression on his face when she'd confronted him on the boardwalk, not guilty exactly, but something more like relieved. The way a person looks when a secret they've been carrying with particular care has finally been safely received. She slept better that night than she had since arriving in Dusty Creek. The following week was not a Friday game week. It was a week of other things. On Tuesday, Ruby met with Hadfield again and gave him the additional fees that Abel had lent her, and Hadfield shook her hand and said he would file the formal opposition to Graves's claim by the end of the week. On Wednesday, Ruby walked out to the edge of town and looked at the land listed on her father's deed from across the fence line, a long rectangle of dry Nevada grass backed by a low ridge of brown hills, with a dried creek bed running along the northern edge and the suggestion of better soil in the dark bands visible near the water line. Her father had told her, in the letter that had come with the deed, that he'd bought it with the idea that it was the kind of land that rewarded patience. He'd never been able to make the trip out himself, had bought it from a land agent without ever seeing it, had intended to come the following summer, and instead had gotten the fever that took him in March. Standing at the fence line with the November wind moving through the grass, Ruby made a quiet private promise to make something of it, and felt her father's presence the way she sometimes did, not as grief exactly but as a kind of solid backing, the way a good coat feels against the cold. On Thursday, Abel Walden rode into town. She saw him from the window of Hadfield's office, where she'd stopped in to pick up a receipt, and he didn't see her. He was on a roan horse that moved with the easy confidence of an animal that trusts its rider, and he pulled up at the general store and swung down and went inside, and Ruby stood at the window longer than was strictly necessary. On Friday, he came to the Silver Lantern and she was already there. They did not play poker that evening, or rather they played, but it was different. Abel sat beside her instead of across from her, which required a brief renegotiation of the seating arrangement that the other players accepted without much fuss, because Abel Walden was the kind of man whose logistical preferences other people tended to accommodate. And he taught her, quietly in the small spaces between hands, the actual mechanics of the game. He showed her how to track which cards had been played. He explained the mathematics of probability in the blunt, practical terms of someone who'd learned it at actual tables rather than from a book. And Ruby found that this version was considerably more useful than the water-damaged volume she'd borrowed from the general store. He pointed out the tells of the men around them with small, subtle gestures, the way Foster tightened his jaw when his hand was poor, the way a young drifter named Collins tapped his ring finger when he was bluffing, the way the third man at the table, an older rancher named Beaumont, went very still when he had something good. Ruby absorbed it all. And she won 2 hands on her own merit, genuinely, with cards that she played correctly by her own judgment. And when she did, Abel said nothing, only nodded, but the expression on his face was the one she'd been trying to name for weeks, and she understood it now. It was pride, the uncomplicated, unselfish kind. They walked home together as they had every Friday. The November night was very cold and their breath showed in the air and the stars above the desert were extraordinary, The way they always were out here where the darkness was real darkness, not the attenuated gray of a city. "Tell me about the ranch," Ruby said, because she wanted to hear him talk. He told her. He described the layout of it, the low hills at the back and the flat grazing land and the creek that ran well in spring and poorly in late summer. He described the work of it, the early mornings and the horses, and the particular satisfaction of land that you have made something of through your own sustained effort. He talked about Emilio, the vaquero, whose wife Luz made tamales at Christmas, and had, the previous year, produced a son named Diego who was already, at 9 months, attempting to walk before his legs were properly ready, and had to be retrieved from under the fence rail with some regularity. Ruby laughed at this, a real laugh, and Abel looked at her when she laughed in a way that she was beginning to understand and beginning to trust. "It sounds like a good life," she said. "It can be," he said, with the particular emphasis of a man saying something specific under the cover of something general. They reached the feed store and stopped. "Ruby," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not technically an answer to what he'd said but was, she thought, an answer to what he'd meant. "I'd like to call on you properly, with your permission." She looked up at him in the cold dark. He was considerably taller than her, and he was looking down at her with that steady, unhurried attention that she had come to associate with the particular experience of being known. "You've been calling on me every Friday for a month," she said. "You just didn't say so." "I know. I'm saying so now." "Yes," she said, and this time it was an answer to what he'd actually asked. He smiled, a real one, wider than the careful smiles he produced in company, and it changed his whole face in a way that she wanted to look at for a long time. "Sunday afternoon," he said. "There's a decent spot out past the ridge where you can see the valley. I'd like to show you if you're willing." "Sunday afternoon," she agreed. He touched his hat and said good night and walked back up the dark street, and Ruby went upstairs and sat on her bed without taking her coat off and allowed herself, for the first time since arriving in Dusty Creek, to think about something that was not the land or the legal fees or the practical arithmetic of survival. She thought about Abel Walden, who had folded a full house for a woman he'd barely known because he'd decided she deserved to win, and who had done it again the next week and the week after, not out of pity but out of something that had grown into something else entirely, and who had walked her home in the cold dark and told her about his ranch and his hired hands and a 9-month-old baby named Diego who kept getting under the fence rail. She thought, "This is a good man." She thought, "I have not felt this particular warmth in a very long time." She thought, "Sunday is 5 days away, and that is an entirely inconvenient distance from now." Sunday came. Abel arrived at the feed store on the roan horse leading a second horse, a compact gray mare with a white blaze, who turned out to be called Patience, and to have a personality that did not particularly match her name, because she was opinionated and quick and kept trying to take a different route than the one Abel pointed her at. Ruby found her immediately congenial. They rode out east of town, past the fence line where Ruby's land began, and Ruby pulled up and looked at her father's ground again, this time from horseback, which made it look different. Larger, more real. "This is it," she said. Abel reined in beside her and looked at the land with the appraising eye of a man who had spent 6 years learning to read terrain. "Good soil near that creek," he said. "The grasses on the north slope are the kind that come back strong in a wet year. Your father chose well." "He never saw it," she said. "He bought it from a description. Still, he chose well." They sat for a moment in silence that was comfortable and not empty, the kind of silence that happens between two people when they do not need words to fill the space. Then they rode on, past her father's land and up toward the ridge, and Abel showed her the valley that lay beyond it, a broad flat expanse of tawny November grass ringed by dark hills, with a hawk working the thermals somewhere above the middle of it and the afternoon sun laying long gold light across the whole scene. "I've seen prettier views from higher up," Abel said, "but this is the one I keep coming back to. Something about the proportions of it, the way the hills sit around it." Ruby understood exactly what he meant. There was a rightness to the landscape, a sense that things were where they were supposed to be. "Did you bring me here to show me the view," she said, "or to show me that you pay attention to things like proportions and the way hills sit?" He turned to look at her. "Both," he admitted. "I appreciate both." They rode back toward town in the long afternoon light, talking easily in the way that was becoming their particular mode, alternating between the practical and the personal without a sharp line between them. Abel told her about his parents, his father who had raised cattle in eastern Texas, and had the stubborn patience that the work required, and had taught it to his son by example rather than instruction. His mother, who had died when he was 14, who had been the kind of woman who made every house she lived in feel like a home through some combination of will and warmth and very good cooking. He spoke about her the way people speak of those they've loved and lost when they've finally made their peace with the losing, which is to say with steadiness and without flinching. Ruby told him about her own mother and her father and the sisters still in Missouri. She told him about the letter her father had written to accompany the deed, how he'd said the land was for her, specifically for her, the one who'd always been most like him in her stubbornness and her tendency to make decisions and then live with them without complaint. "He sounds like he knew you well," Abel said. "Better than anyone," Ruby said, and felt the old ache, which was familiar enough by now to be bearable. Abel reached across the small space between their horses and put his hand briefly over hers where it rested on the saddle horn, just for a moment, warm and steady. Then he took it back, and they rode on. She thought about that touch for 2 days afterward. November moved through its second week, and then its third, and the legal proceedings around Ruby's land claim began to take their complex, slow-moving shape. Hadfield was good, precise, and prepared, and Graves's lawyer, a man named Carver from Reno who had come to Dusty Creek specifically for the case, was exactly as sharp and unscrupulous as Hadfield had described. He filed a countermotion challenging the provenance of the original land transaction, suggesting that Ruby's father had not had clear title when he made the purchase, which was a claim that required Hadfield to dig up records from a transaction that had occurred in 1878 and had not been documented with particular thoroughness. It was going to take time. Ruby tried not to let the frustration of it show too obviously, but it was difficult. She was paying for her room by the week and her savings had been entirely committed to legal fees, and she was looking, with careful attention, at whether there was any work available in Dusty Creek that she could take on. The possibilities were limited. She could do bookkeeping, which was her strongest skill, but the businesses in town that kept accounts were mostly managing them internally and not in need of help. Vera Calloway offered her 2 evenings a week serving at the bar, which Ruby accepted without false pride about the nature of the work, because she needed the money and Vera was a woman she trusted. Abel, when he heard this, offered her a different kind of arrangement. His ranch books, he said, were kept in a state that he described with remarkable honesty as organized chaos. He had a running sense of the finances but no systematic record-keeping, and a proper ledger would help him understand where the operation was strong and where it was losing ground. Would she be willing to spend 2 or 3 mornings a week at the ranch putting the books in order, for a reasonable payment? Ruby said she would, and tried not to examine too carefully whether she was agreeing for the financial necessity or for the excuse it provided to spend more time at Abel Walden's ranch. Both reasons seemed legitimate. She accepted them both. She went out to the ranch for the first time on a Monday in late November, riding patients, whom Abel had made available to her for as long as she needed transportation. The ranch was a compact, well-organized operation, the buildings in better repair than she'd expected, the corrals solid and functional, the barn large enough to shelter the operation's needs without being excessive. Emilio was there when she arrived, a lean, weathered man of 40 with a careful dignity and a considering look that shifted, over the course of the first morning, into something that Ruby read as provisional approval. "Pete," the younger hand, was 21 and had the cheerful guilelessness of someone who had not yet been given sufficient reason to be cynical, and he greeted Ruby with the open friendliness of a person who found most things genuinely interesting and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. The ranch house itself was a two-room structure with a lean-to addition on the back that served as a kitchen, functional and spare in the way of a place built by someone who had spent their energy on practical priorities. Abel had cleared the kitchen table and stacked the papers that constituted his record-keeping in a collection of boxes that, when Ruby opened the first one, proved to contain a genuinely impressive accumulation of bills, receipts, informal accounts, and the occasional letter. "This," Ruby said, looking at the first box with the expression of a person who has agreed to swim a river and is now standing on the bank actually looking at the river, "is going to take considerable time." "I know," Abel said, with the slightly abashed look of someone who has been aware of a problem for a while and is slightly relieved someone else is now also aware of it. "We'll start with the cattle accounts," Ruby said, and rolled up her sleeves, metaphorically speaking, since the November air in an unheated kitchen did not encourage literal sleeve rolling. She spent the first morning organizing, the second morning building a framework, the third morning beginning to make actual sense of the numbers. Abel brought her coffee at intervals and occasionally sat across the table from her reviewing things she put in front of him, and the domestic naturalness of this, two people working in the same space with comfortable ease, was something Ruby noticed and did not comment on. December arrived and brought with it the particular cold of a Nevada winter, which was not the damp cold of Missouri, but the dry, sharp cold of high desert, the kind that got into your bones if you were not moving and left the moment you were. On the first Friday of December, they went to the Silver Lantern again, and Ruby played poker for the first time entirely on her own merits, with Abel across the table from her as an opponent rather than a covert ally, and the experience was completely different. The game had a different texture. There was a particular charge to competing against him, to watching him and trying to read him the way he'd taught her to read the others, and she found that Abel Walden, when he was actually trying to win, was considerably harder to read than the other men at the table. She lost the first hand to him and did not mind it. She won the second and felt the specific satisfaction of having earned it genuinely, no elaborate shadow game underneath it, just her own judgment against his. He beat her in the end, the overall pot going to him over the course of the evening, and when she pushed her remaining chips across the table she said, "You're good at this." "I've had practice," he said, and his eyes were warm. "When you were folding full houses on purpose," she said, "were you finding it difficult to keep a straight face?" He considered this with apparent seriousness. "There was one hand the third week," he said, "when you bluffed Foster out of a pot you had no business winning, and I very nearly laughed. That was the closest. And you held it. I had considerable motivation to hold it." They walked home through December cold that was serious about its business, and their breath made clouds in the air, and at some point along the dark street their hands found each other in a natural, unrehearsed way, and neither of them remarked on it, and they walked the rest of the way to the feed store like that. At the door, Ruby turned to face him, and he was looking at her with that clear, particular attention that she'd stopped trying to be sensible about. "Abel," she said. "Ruby," he said, "I'm going to say something that I want you to hear carefully. I'm listening. When I found out what you'd been doing with the card games, my first feeling was anger. I know, you managed it well. My second feeling," she said and paused, "was the feeling of realizing that someone had been taking care of me without making me feel small for needing it, without making it about what they wanted in return. You did it quietly, and when I discovered it, you didn't try to minimize it or explain it away. You just said yes, and then you told me the truth about all of it." She looked at him steadily. "That is not a common thing. I want you to know that I understand that." Abel was quiet for a moment. "Ruby," he said carefully, "I need to be honest with you. I started doing it because it seemed like the right thing, but I kept doing it because I was falling in love with you, and I should have told you that sooner and better." The cold night air was very still. "You're telling me now," she said. "Yes." She leaned up and kissed him, which was the most direct thing she'd done in an already direct month, and his hands came up to hold her face with a care that was itself a kind of statement. And the kiss was the kind that you know while it's happening is one you are going to remember for the rest of your life. When they separated, both of them stood for a moment adjusting to a world that had just shifted slightly on its axis. "That's something," Abel said quietly. "It is," Ruby agreed. She went upstairs and he walked back up the street in the December dark, and Ruby sat on her bed with her hands in her lap and felt, somewhere in her chest, the particular warmth of something that has been growing quietly for weeks and has finally been given permission to be itself. Christmas in Dusty Creek was a modest affair, but it had its own character. Vera Calloway decorated the silver lantern with pine boughs that smelled resinous and good, and the general store set out a small selection of gift items, and the small church at the west end of town held a service that was attended by most of the town's population, because there was not much else available, and because Reverend Mills had a gift for the kind of sermon that made you feel the world was meaningful without making you feel guilty about the ways you'd been living in it. Ruby attended with the Calloway household, which included Vera's niece Clara, who was 17 and had opinions about everything, and expressed them with a forcefulness that Ruby found refreshing. Abel attended from his ranch, arriving with Emilio and Emilio's wife Luz and baby Diego, who had by this point graduated from attempting to walk to actually walking, with the wide-legged determined gait of a child who has discovered locomotion and intends to use it maximally. Luz pressed baby Diego into Ruby's arms at some point during the gathering after the service, with the particular decisiveness of a woman who has made an assessment and acted on it, and Diego looked up at Ruby with the frank, considering expression of a 9-month-old evaluating a new situation, and then grabbed a strand of her hair with the grip of someone who has discovered levers. Abel, standing nearby, watched this with an expression that he clearly thought was neutral but which was, in fact, something else. "He likes you," Luz said, in her accented but precise English, and smiled with the manner of a woman who considers this an important data point. "He likes my hair," Ruby corrected, gently retrieving the strand. "Or at least he likes what he can do with it." Emilio said something to Abel in Spanish that made Abel look at the ground with a slight smile, and Ruby, who spoke no Spanish, decided not to ask for a translation. Christmas dinner was at Vera Calloway's table, and Abel was invited, and the warmth of the gathered meal was the particular warmth of chosen company, which Ruby felt as a thing distinct from and in some ways richer than the warmth of family, because family is given to you, and chosen company means someone has looked at who you are and decided they would like to spend time with it. After dinner, in the cold, clear Christmas evening, Abel and Ruby walked to the edge of town and stood looking at the valley in the starlight, and he told her he loved her properly this time, plainly and without preamble, because he was a man who, once he'd made a decision, followed through on it without fuss. She told him she loved him too, which was true and had been true for some time, and the admission felt like setting down something heavy that you'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. January brought cold and a new development in the legal proceedings. Hadfield came to find Ruby at the feed store with a letter from the Territorial Land Office that provided the documentation of the original 1878 transaction, records that definitively established that her father had had clear title, and that Graves's counterclaim had no legitimate basis. Carver, the lawyer from Reno, filed 2 additional motions that Hadfield dealt with efficiently, and by the end of January the proceedings were moving clearly in Ruby's favor. Graves himself appeared in Dusty Creek during the 2nd week of January, and Ruby encountered him at the general store. He was a wide, prosperous-looking man in his late 40s with the air of someone who was not accustomed to having his expectations frustrated, and he looked at Ruby with a calculating assessment that she found considerably less intimidating than he probably intended. "Miss Prescott," he said, "I hope we can resolve this matter to everyone's satisfaction." "Mr. Graves," she said, "I intend to resolve it in full satisfaction of myself and my father's wishes, which I expect will not be particularly satisfying to you, and I hope that's something you'll be making your peace with in the coming weeks." Graves had looked at her for a moment with something that might have been re-evaluation. Then he'd said, stiffly, that he wished her a good day and left. Ruby bought her supplies and went back to the ranch to finish the December ledger entries. And when she told Abel about the encounter that afternoon over coffee in the kitchen, he laughed outright, which was a different sound than his usual contained amusement, fuller and easier, and she liked it considerably. The land ruling came through in late February. Hadfield brought the paperwork himself, riding out to the ranch where Ruby was working on the books because he'd correctly estimated that was where she would be. He came in through the door with a look on his face that told the story before the words did, and he placed the document on the kitchen table with a satisfied formality. Ruby read it carefully, even though she could see what it said from the first paragraph. The claim was upheld. The land was hers. Graves's counterpetition had been rejected in its entirety. Her father's deed was fully and legally valid. She sat with the paper in her hands for a moment and thought about her father buying a piece of Nevada land from a description in a letter, never seeing it, trusting in the idea of it, leaving it to her with the note that said it was for the one who was most like him in her stubbornness. Abel came in from the barn, having seen Hadfield's horse outside, and read the situation from her expression and the document on the table and said, "Ruby." She stood up and he crossed the room and she put her face against his chest and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of everything she'd carried since she'd gotten on the stage in Missouri to come to Nevada. The grief for her father, the uncertainty of the legal fight, the weeks of Friday poker games, the careful maintenance of composure in a town full of people watching to see if she'd last. All of it. Abel held her with the steadiness of a man who understood that sometimes what a person needs is simply to be held, without being told they're doing fine. After a while she lifted her head and he brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, gently, without comment, and she said, "I need to write to my sisters." "Of course," he said. Hadfield, who had been examining the kitchen wall with diplomatic interest, turned back around and said he would be sending his final invoice by the end of the week, and congratulated Ruby with the warm formality of a man who had done his job well and was pleased about it. After he left, Ruby and Abel walked out to the land together, riding across the brown, spring-approaching Nevada grass, and stood on what was now officially and fully her ground and looked at it. "What will you do with it?" Abel asked. "I've been thinking about that," Ruby said. "The soil near the creek is good enough for some crops. The upper portion is decent grazing land. It could support a modest cattle operation if someone were willing to work it." She paused. "Or it could be combined with neighboring land and make something considerably more substantial." Abel was very quiet. "Hypothetically," Ruby added and looked at him sideways. He looked back at her, and the expression on his face was the one she'd first tried to name on a Friday evening in October and now knew entirely, that quiet, deep, specific warmth. "Ruby Prescott," he said, "I have been in love with you since the second Friday you walked into the Silver Lantern with your $40 and your ink-stained cuff and your absolute determination to win at a game you'd learned from a water-damaged book." She felt something rise in her chest that was half laughter and half something much more serious. "You noticed the ink stain. I noticed everything about you. I have not stopped noticing. Abel. I'm asking you to marry me," he said, direct and clear and without flourish, because he was not a man who dressed things up when the plain version was the true one. "I'm asking because I love you, and because I think we would do very well together, and because this land and that land could make something real, but mostly because I cannot think about the future without you in it, and I have given up trying." The February light was thin and cold, and the dead grass was pale, and the creek was frozen at the edges. And Ruby stood on her father's land that was now her land and looked at the man who had folded a full house so she could win a game she hadn't known how to play, and felt the answer in her chest long before she put it into words. "Yes," she said, "with two conditions." "Name them." "The books are going to be kept in a proper ledger from this point forward, and you're going to let me manage the accounts of both operations because you have clearly demonstrated that you are not suited to paper work." He almost smiled. "And the second, you have to teach me to actually play poker, properly. No more letting me win." "I already agreed to that. I want it on record." "Agreed, both conditions." She took his hand, cold in the February air, and he laced his fingers through hers, and they stood on her father's land looking at the valley that lay between her acres and his, at the possibility of it, at everything that waited to be built. They were married in April. Reverend Mills performed the ceremony at the small church on the west end of town, and the whole town came, because the whole town had been watching the story unfold for 6 months and felt some communal investment in its conclusion. Vera Calloway sat in the front pew and wept with the unself-conscious freedom of a woman who sees no reason to pretend she isn't moved by things that move her. Emilio stood with Abel at the front of the church, having been asked to serve as his witness, and stood with the dignified pride of a man who has watched someone he respected find what he deserved. Luz sat in the front row with Diego on her lap, Diego having been dressed in his finest, which was a white shirt that he immediately got dusty by investigating the floor between the pews. Abel's 2 sisters-in-law, Ruby's younger sisters Cora and me, had made the journey from Missouri, which had taken 2 weeks, and the determination that runs in families with bookkeeping fathers. Cora was 23 and me was 21, and they both cried, which set Vera off again, and Ruby herself managed to keep her composure through the ceremony mostly by concentrating on Abel's face, which was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something significant, and was being very intentional about remaining upright and steady about it. When he said the words "I do" in his plain, certain voice, Ruby felt them land somewhere deep and permanent. She said her own vows in the voice of a woman who meant every word and knew it, and when Abel put the simple gold band on her finger with hands that were not quite steady, she loved him more precisely than she ever had before, because the tremble in those steady hands told her what she already knew, that this mattered to him the way it mattered to her, and that they were both standing at the beginning of the same thing together. After the ceremony, the reception was held at the Silver Lantern, because Vera had insisted, and because it was the largest indoor space in Dusty Creek, and because it was, by this point, a place with its own significance to both of them. The piano player worked through his 4 songs in a more festive tempo, and someone brought a fiddle, and the sawdust floor hosted dancing until late in the evening. Abel danced with Ruby twice, careful and focused in the way of a man who is a competent dancer, but knows he is not a natural one, and she danced with the ease of someone who had grown up in a house with music in it. The second time, he pulled her slightly closer than strict formality required, and she didn't move away, and Vera Calloway watched from behind the bar with an expression of profound satisfaction. Cora danced with Pete the ranch hand, who was delighted and 21 and completely earnest about it, and me sat with Emilio and Luz, and attempted a conversation in fractured Spanish that Luz assisted with good humor and Emilio received with grave courtesy. Ruby danced one more time with Abel, close in the amber lamplight while the fiddle played something slow, and said against his shoulder, "I've been thinking about the North Field, the one along the creek. The soil there is rich enough for a kitchen garden, more than a kitchen garden, something proper. Spring's the right time to start it. I know, I want to put in beans and squash and a section for herbs. And I want to plant 1 apple tree. It might take years to bear fruit. I know, that's the point of it." He was quiet for a moment and then, "1 apple tree. 1 apple tree, she confirmed. They moved together to the slow fiddle music, and Ruby felt the warmth of the room and the warmth of his arm around her. And the warmth that she was beginning to understand was simply what her life felt like now. This specific quality of warmth that came from being in the right place with the right person after a long time of standing in the cold. They moved into the ranch house together that spring. The process of combining the two households was practical and occasionally negotiated and generally pleasant. Ruby's things were fewer than Abel's but more organized, and the introduction of her systematic approach to the house's management produced a general improvement that even Pete, who was not particularly observant about domestic arrangements, commented on approvingly. The land was combined into a single operation. Ruby's parcel, with its creek and its rich lower soil, complemented Abel's grazing land in exactly the way she'd hypothesized when she'd looked at the map back in February, and the combination of the two created something that Emilio, with his long experience, said was the foundation of a genuinely good ranch. The kitchen garden went in that May, and with it, the apple tree. She planted it herself, with Abel watching from the fence rail, on a warm afternoon when the first real spring green was coming into the Nevada hills. She chose the spot with care, far enough from the house to give it room, close enough to the creek for the water table to assist it through the dry summers. She put it in the ground with the deliberateness of a woman making a promise. "Your father would have liked this," Abel said from the fence rail. "I think he would have liked all of it," Ruby said. "The land working, the books in order, you." "He'd have tested me," Abel said. "Wanted to know my intentions." "Your intentions were evident to the whole town 6 months before I knew about them. In my defense, I was not being subtle. I was just being patient." She stood up from the ground and dusted her hands and looked at the small tree, no taller than her waist, its new leaves bright in the afternoon sun. "Patient is a word for it," she agreed. That summer was a working summer, the kind that built something solid, the rhythm of the ranch and the kitchen garden and the books and the gradual, accruing knowledge of each other that comes not from dramatic revelation, but from the daily accumulation of small true things. Ruby learned the timing of the cattle work, the seasonal logic of the operation, the particular vocabulary of a ranching life. Abel learned the satisfaction of accounts that made sense, of being able to look at a ledger and understand precisely where the operation stood. Emilio taught Ruby to make tortillas, which she approached with the methodical seriousness she brought to everything new and which produced, after several failed attempts and one incident with too much salt, a result that Luz pronounced acceptable and that Ruby refused to stop making until she got them right. She got them right by August. The following year brought 2 things that changed the shape of their life. The first was the arrival of Abel's brother James from Oregon, who came through Dusty Creek in September on his way somewhere else, and stayed for a month, because the ranch needed an extra hand that fall and because James was, underneath his wandering, a man who had been looking for a reason to stop moving. He was 32, quiet and capable, and he and Cora, who was still corresponding with Ruby regularly, and came to visit that October, regarded each other with the particular careful wariness of 2 people who are aware something is happening that they haven't decided to acknowledge yet. That was its own story, beginning. The second thing was the discovery in the late spring that Ruby was pregnant. She told Abel on a Sunday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with a directness that was simply how she did things. He sat very still for a moment, the way he went still when something mattered more than usual, and then he stood up and came around the table and pulled her up from her chair and held her with such careful, contained feeling that she could feel all the things he hadn't yet said in the steadiness of his arms. "Boy or girl," he said eventually, "doesn't matter." "I know," she said, "but I have a feeling." "What kind of feeling?" "Kind that says we're going to need to add to the collection of white shirts that Diego keeps making dusty." Abel laughed into her hair, that full easy laugh she'd been collecting like something precious. "We'll see," he said. She was right. Their son, Thomas James Walden, arrived in February, which made his first entry into the world a cold one, but he came into it with a vigor that the midwife, a calm, practical woman named Martha who had been at this business for 22 years, described as determined. He was red-faced and emphatic, and had, from the first hour, a very definite sense of his own opinion, which Ruby thought was probably something he'd inherited from both sides simultaneously. Abel held him in the first hour with the expression of a man whose internal foundations have just been gently and permanently rearranged, and Ruby, watching from the pillow where she was catching her breath, thought that this was the image she would carry with her forever if she needed reminding of what mattered most. Thomas James Walden, who had come into the world on a cold Nevada February morning and been received into very capable hands. Emilio and Luz brought Diego to meet him, and Diego examined the baby with the wide-eyed sobriety of a 2-year-old confronting something entirely new, and then tried to give Thomas his wooden horse, which Luz gently redirected, but which made both Ruby and Abel smile with the particular tenderness of new parents who are still learning that every small thing is enormous. Spring came again, the 4th spring since Ruby had arrived in Dusty Creek, and with it the apple tree put out blossoms for the first time. She was in the garden when she noticed Thomas on a blanket in the shade, and she stood looking at the white flowers with a feeling she couldn't entirely name, which was something about patience and time and the things that grow slowly that are worth the wait. Abel came out of the barn and saw her standing at the apple tree and came over and stood beside her and looked at the blossoms. "Your father chose well," he said again, meaning more than the land. "He did," she said. She leaned against Abel's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the spring afternoon sun and looked at the blossoming tree, while Thomas Walden made exploratory sounds at a patch of grass from his blanket, practicing a vocabulary that was still mostly internal but that was becoming more external by the day. The ranch had grown. The combination of her land and his had proved, over 3 years of careful management and Emilio's expertise and Abel's patient, persistent work, to be exactly what she'd estimated it could be when she'd stood on the frozen February ground with a legal ruling in her hand and looked at the valley between their parcels. They had added to the herd and built a second barn and put a fence along the North Creek line that she was proud of, not because she'd built it herself, but because she designed the placement of it and the design had been correct. The books were in perfect order, had been in perfect order since November of 1882, when she'd opened the first box and stared at the accumulated chaos of a man who was better at cattle than paperwork, and had set to work with characteristic determination. Dusty Creek had not changed dramatically in 3 years, which was something she appreciated. Vera Calloway still ran the Silver Lantern with military efficiency and ample warmth. Hadfield still kept his office above the telegraph station. The piano player still worked through his 4 songs. Foster still wore his red handkerchief and lost money at cards, though he'd learned not to grumble about it. Ruby still played poker occasionally, properly, with skills she'd built honestly, and she won a fair proportion of the time and lost a fair proportion, which was how it was supposed to be, and she preferred it immeasurably to winning every hand through someone else's careful engineering. She had said as much to Abel once, and he'd said, "You were winning some of them yourself, even that first month, more than you knew." She'd thought about that and decided it was true, and that it was good to know it. On the 4th anniversary of their first poker game, which fell on a Friday, they went to the Silver Lantern together. Thomas was with Luz for the evening, a domestic arrangement that had become comfortable and reciprocal, Ruby taking Diego when Emilio and Luz needed time, Luz taking Thomas with serene competence when Ruby and Abel wanted an evening that was only theirs. They sat at the poker table, across from each other, and played. Abel played to win, because she'd made him promise years ago that he would, and she played with everything she knew, which was considerable by now, and the game was close and tightly contested, and full of the particular pleasure of two people who know each other very well trying to read each other across a table. She won the last hand of the evening on a genuine bluff, holding almost nothing, pushing forward with the steady nerve she'd had to manufacture on that third Friday 4 years ago and now simply had, organically, as part of herself. She watched Abel's face as he read her, watched him weigh it, and watched him make the wrong call. He folded. She laid down her cards, the almost nothing of them, and looked at him. He looked at her cards and then at her face and shook his head slowly with the smile that was wider than his careful public ones. "You bluffed me," he said. "I did. I've been teaching you poker for 3 years and you just bluffed me. You were an excellent teacher." Vera Calloway, who had been watching from behind the bar with the manner of someone watching a closing scene, said, "She wins again, Abel. Some things don't change." Abel looked across the table at Ruby with those deep, quiet brown eyes that she had been looking into for 4 years and knew she would be looking into for the rest of her life. And his expression was the one she tried to name in October of 1882 and had eventually understood was simply love, in its uncomplicated, daily, entirely decided form. "Some things don't," he agreed. They walked home in the autumn dark, the same dark street they'd walked 100 times, their hands finding each other in the same natural, unrehearsed way that had started one December night and had not stopped. The stars above the Nevada desert were the same extraordinary stars they always were, and Dusty Creek was the same small weathered town, and the ranch 4 miles out was the same operation it had been, extended and improved but fundamentally the same land, the same work, the same low hills at the back and the flat grazing ground in the creek. And the apple tree behind the house was bearing fruit for the first time that autumn, round and a little tart and startlingly red against the dry Nevada green, and Ruby had made the first batch of apple preserves from it in August, and the jars were lined up on the kitchen shelf. Thomas Walden, 14 months old and in full command of walking and partial command of running, had discovered the apple tree that summer and developed a proprietary relationship with the fallen fruit that required supervision. Because he had his mother's stubbornness and his father's patience, and the combination of both produced a very determined small person who would sit under the apple tree for long periods examining a single apple, with the focused interest of someone who finds the world genuinely fascinating. Ruby thought about him, on the walk home, and about the second child she now knew was coming, sometime in the spring, Thomas's sibling, who would arrive into a house that was warm and full and built on honest ground. She thought about her father's letter and the deed and the $40 she'd carried into the Silver Lantern on the first Friday in September of 1882 with her heart in her stomach and her chin level. She thought about the man walking beside her, who had sat across a poker table and made quiet, costly decisions on her behalf before she'd known his last name, who had taught her cards and walked her home and shown her a valley from a ridge and asked her to marry him on frozen ground in February light. She thought about a full house laid face down and what it had eventually amounted to. Abel squeezed her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked in the low, steady voice that was simply the voice of her daily life now, as familiar and essential as the sound of the creek in spring. "Cards," she said, "cards, and everything else." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "That first Friday, when you walked in, you had no idea what you were doing, none at all. You sat down like you owned the room. I had to, I couldn't afford to look otherwise. You were terrifying," he said, and meant it as a compliment. She laughed. "You were folding full houses at me. We were both pretending." "I was not pretending about the important part." "No," she said, and held his hand tighter in the dark. "Neither was I." They reached the ranch, the lamplight warm in the windows, Thomas asleep inside with Luz, who would be waiting to hand him off and get back to her own home and her own sleeping household. The apple tree was a dark shape against the lighter dark of the sky, and the stars were very bright, and the Nevada night was cold with the particular clean cold of autumn at altitude. Ruby Prescott Walden stood at the door of her house, on her land beside her husband, and felt the full weight of everything she'd built from $40 and a borrowed poker strategy, and a letter from her father and the stubborn refusal to lose what was hers. She felt complete. Not in the way that suggests there is nothing more to come, because there was Thomas and the child coming in spring, and the second apple tree she was planning to plant in the north corner, and the books that needed finishing, and the cattle that needed moving down from the high pasture before the first real snow. Life had its full, ongoing business still ahead. Complete in the way that means you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are supposed to be doing, with exactly the right person beside you. Abel opened the door and warm light spilled out and Ruby walked inside. The land was hers. The life was hers. And the man who had once folded a full house so that she could win was standing behind her, pulling the door shut against the cold home.